Hello, my name's Gurnos Davies and I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Oxford. My thesis looks at women's agency and the materiality of the stage in contemporary theatre making, and the project's facilitated by an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded collaborative doctoral award, through which I work as an embedded researcher with the Theatre Chipping Norton in Oxfordshire and the Royal and Derngate Theatre in Northampton. I observed their practices of theatre making, which is informed by my own professional experience as a costume and wig freelancer. So in this talk, I'm going to explore how the agency of costume alters when placed in different relationships to the performing body, both on stage and in rehearsals. I argue particularly for the value of proximity as a critical tool that might be used to interrogate the spatial, haptic, and signifying relationships enacted between the material and corporeal in the process of costuming. While the nature of the interaction between bodies and costumes has been the subject of much critical discussion, the relationship has seldom been addressed in spatial terms. When spatially situated language is employed, it's predominantly used in a conceptual rather than actual context. So, for instance, Rachel Han refers to the conceptual gap opened up for critical thought when reflecting on the distinct functions of costume and everyday dress. In contrast, the spatial relationship I consider in this talk is actual. I use the term proximity to describe a paradoxical togetherness and separation of body and costume, in order to unpick the kinds of agency we might ascribe to each party. And I explore this notion of proximity with examples drawn from the world premiere of Bryony Lavery's adaptation of The Lovely Bones, which was directed by Melly Still for the Royal and Derngate Theatre in Northampton in 2018. It's a page-to-stage adaptation based on Alice Sebold's best-selling 2002 novel. Set in 1970s Pennsylvania, the story follows the perspective of 14-year-old Susie Salmon. And Susie's a protagonist with a difference. Recently deceased, she observes the fallout from her sexual assault and murder from heaven. She watches the actions of her friends and family back on Earth as they come to terms with her death, while at the same time she attempts to help the detectives embroiled in the investigation to track down her murderer, so that she can let go of her old life and embrace her new afterlife in heaven. Melly Still's approach to the production draws on techniques associated with physical theatre and uses the material resources of the stage, including costume, in an imaginative fashion as crucial elements of meaning-making. The kinds of proximity enacted between costume and body are therefore varied and, at times, even unexpected, generating thought-provoking moments through which to consider the potential agency of costume and how it might shift in the duration of performance. So in this talk, I'm going to use two examples from this production of The Lovely Bones to examine three distinct enactments of proximity, before reflecting on what this might tell us about the interrelationships between costume, agency, and the performing body. So our first encounter with costume behaving in an unexpected fashion occurs near the beginning of the play, when Susie recounts her assault by Mr. Harvey. As the actress playing Susie, Charlotte Beaumont, narrates the encounter, she and the actor playing Mr. Harvey, Keith Dunphy, simultaneously act it out on stage. When they reach the moment of Susie's assault, costume is used to disrupt the representation of violence. Mr. Harvey instructs Susie to take off her parka. When she hurriedly pulls her jacket tightly around herself and attempts to leave, he rips the garment from her body and slams it to the floor. In that moment, the actress playing Susie simultaneously manipulates her upright body to mimic the form of the coat. In the rehearsal room, where I spent several weeks as an embedded researcher, Melly Still worked with Beaumont to choreograph a physical correspondence between the actress's body and the discarded costume. Closely examining the form of the coat lying prostrate on the floor, Beaumont twisted her spine, thrust out her arms, and jolted forwards, synchronising her movements with the thud of the garment as it hit the stage. And this is a crucial moment where we see proximity between costume and actress enacted. The coat is removed from the body, set apart in spatial terms, while retaining an interconnection with the actress through their shared signification of Susie's body. So might this then be understood as an expression of costume's agency? Certainly, new materialist thinking promotes an inclusive approach to what might be understood to have the capacity for agency. In general terms, a new materialist understanding of agency elides the primacy of human intentionality as the sole factor that determines action. Instead, the efficacy, the force, or the power of things, both human and material, are observed as enactments of agency as they affect other agents interconnected in relational networks or assemblages. In models such as Latour's actor network theory or Jane Bennett's vibrant assemblages, which draw on Guattari and Deleuze, agency is a collaborative process, no longer confined to the human subject. In the context of performance studies, this thinking has been used to address the co-constitution of meaning generated by interactions between performers and stage objects, including costume. For instance, using the example of the turn-of-the-century dancer Maud Allen and her Salome costume, Marley Schweitzer conceives of costume as, quote, a choreographic thing, end quote, that has the potential to direct performance through its sheer materiality. In turn, Rachel Hand's theorisation of the hug of costuming describes, quote, an effective reciprocal exchange between body and costume, where the immediacy of the costume act affects both the worn and the wearer, end quote. In Hand's model, then, costume is conceived as, quote, an effective and reactive performance agent, end quote, both shaping and shaped by its interaction with the performing body. The tactile engagement of the material and corporeal described by Schweitzer and Hahn is evidenced in another use of costume in the staging of The Lovely Bones. Once Susie begins to acclimate to her new life in heaven, she's introduced to a gaggle of heavenly girls who were also victims of Mr. Harvey's violence on Earth. Continuing with her experimental use of costume in the production, Melly Still depicts these ghostly characters using disembodied dresses. Made by the costume team based at the Royal and Derngate, where the production was rehearsed and premiered, the dresses were not made in proportion to actors' bodies in the company. Instead, the size and style of the costumes reflected the age and period in which the characters, the heavenly girls, died. In performance, these dresses were enlivened through the gesture and vocalisation of actors in the company. Each threaded their arm through one of the sleeves of the dress so that their hand appeared at the cuff as though that of the heavenly girl. They then supported the frame of the garment at the neck of the dress with their other hand, giving the impression of a skeletal structure. The garments were consequently animated through points of haptic contact and might be understood as costume cum puppets. The performance was collaboratively shaped by the actors' manipulation of the unworn dresses, which, in turn, responded to the form of the dresses, which exerted resistance to certain gestural movements. The reciprocity of this relationship is fundamental to conceptualizations of the ambiguous nature of agency shared between material object and performer that's well versed in puppet studies. For, in performance, the human subject who animates the puppet is paradoxically rendered invisible to a spectator. Even when the operator of the puppet is visible on stage and physically intertwined with the performing object, if the puppeteering is successful, the spectator understands that they're meant to perceive the puppet as the signifying subject rather than the performer. In The Lovely Bones, this process of signification was established through the relationship of proximity enacted between performers and costume cum puppet. The actors stooped, shuffled and hunched their bodies to ensure that the puppets were held away from their torsos. In so doing, they demonstrated through their physicality that their own bodies were not to be interpolated into the subjectivities of the characters. This was intended to reside in the dresses, the subjectivity. Yet simultaneously, the dresses were animated through their tactile connection to the bodies of the performers. They were conceptually separate, even while physically intertwined in spatial terms. The performer and costume cum puppet therefore generate meaning in performance through the signifying dynamics of their simultaneous separation and togetherness. The mutual force enacted by garment and performer unsettles distinctions that might be made between the ontological nature of subject and object, as it becomes unclear which is shaping the other through their collaborative co-constitution of action. And it's in this realm of uncertainty, perhaps, that costume's potential for agency might be located. So, reflecting on this, how then might we conceive of the agency of Susie's discarded coat in the first example? Unlike the examples provided by Schweitzer, Hahn, and even the costume cum puppets in The Lovely Bones, the physical interaction between the material and the corporeal is not sustained. While Beaumont is responsive to the form of the coat, she's not physically participating in the tensions and constraining forces of the garments as if it was worn upon the body. To what extent, then, might we conceive of costume to have agency when it's not in physical contact with a performing body? So let's return to that first scene I described at the beginning of my talk. Once Susie's coat has been discarded on the stage, Dunphy, so the actor playing Mr. Harvey, pulls Beaumont tight to his body so she's trapped in his grasp. As she's restrained, a pre-recorded audio depicting the character's struggle plays out into the auditorium. During Susie Beaumont's accompanying account of the horrifying assault, doubles of the costume worn by Beaumont are thrown onto the stage by other company members who are purposely visible at the margins of the action. Item by item, garments fly through the air to land, crumpled, around the coat, to represent the clothes discarded from Susie's body as she's undressed, and also representing the discarded body that she leaves on Earth. So we see yellow corduroy trousers, a pink shirt, a knitted sleeveless pullover, and 2 white bobby socks. Unlike the example of the coat, Beaumont does not mimic the form of these garments as they land on the stage. She is, after all, trapped in Dunphy's grasp. Yet, lying there, through their association with Susie's experience, established through their correspondence to the costume worn by the actress and her prior relationship to the coat, their signification exceeds that of an inanimate object. They seem to vibrate with meaning, energised by their participation in the representation of Susie's experience, even while they remain physically immobile. A similar expression of the uncanny aliveness of costume is described by Aoife Monks as she relates the experience of being confronted by unworn costume outside a performance, in this case backstage in a dressing room. She argues that on stage, performance conditions generate a fantasy of seamlessness between actor, costume and character when observed from the perspective of the spectator. In this performance context, costume cannot, quote, quite be understood as an autonomous object or as distinct from actors. Rather, the audience's engagement with an actor in costume is one where the corporeal and material are enmeshed, the other always already signifying through its tactile entanglement with the other. Consequently, Monks proposes that costume might best be conceived as, quote, bodies that can be taken off, and it's precisely this seamless yet removable aspect of stage dress that she suggests makes costume, quote, so uncanny when unworn, peculiar and disembodied. Might then a recognition of the uncanny quality of Susie's discarded garments in the Lovely Bones be attributed to their status as a body that could be taken off? Implicit in Monks' characterisation of unworn costume as uncanny is perhaps the question of proximity. Discarded, the seamlessness between actor, character and costume is disrupted. A spatial gap opened up between the material and the corporeal that shifts the relationship from one of enmeshment to one of proximity. After all, despite the separation, actor and costume both continue to signify as proxy bodies for the character. The items of clothing utilised in this sequence of the Lovely Bones are never worn by Beaumont like the coat. They've not been removed on stage. Instead, the proximity between the body of the actress and the costume is fashioned through the treatment of the garments ahead of performance. So in rehearsals, many still insisted that the garments had to be broken down, that is, worn in, before introduced to the stage space. She asked the actors charged with throwing the disembodied costume on stage to bag out the brand new socks with their hands and to scuff the knees of the corduroy trousers on the floor of the stage. And these preparatory activities encouraged the spectator to connect the costume with Susie's embodied experience, not through Beaumont's direct mimicking of their form, but through the treatment of the garments themselves. The stretched, scuffed and bagged out costume captures a ghostly trace of embodiment that generates an excess of signification on stage as they exceed categorisation as inanimate objects. Such excess has been understood by new materialist theorists like Jane Bennett as evidence of the agency of the material. Things exceed their status as material objects and are understood as, quote, vivid entities not entirely reducible to the context in which human subjects set them. Of course, with regards to Susie's discarded clothes and the Lovely Bones, this excess of meaning is a representational strategy intentionally employed by Still to make the costume signify as a proxy body for the character. is not the result of an unexpected encounter with the material world that's so often the focus of new materialist studies. Still's production consequently demonstrates the potential value of theatre as a critical tool with which to map out alternative expressions of the material world's capacity for agency within an imaginative representational form. So, what conclusions might we draw about the interrelationship between costume agency and the notion of proximity from these examples taken from the Lovely Bones? While we might expect an object to have a greater potential for agency when it appears to act independently from a human subject, following new materialist thinking, I suggest it is actually in the distinct relationship of proximity between the material and the corporeal that costume's agency might be found, this together yet separateness. Employed as a critical tool, proximity consequently works to conceptualise the complex dynamics between body and costume, and the multifaceted expressions of this relationship in spatial, haptic, and signifying terms. The unconventional use of costume under scrutiny in this talk might also prompt us to consider broader questions about the nature of agency and the materiality of the stage. Does, for instance, the shifting relationship between body and garment determine how we might categorise a theatrical thing, for instance as costume, prop or puppet? And does this categorisation, in turn, affect the capacity for agency we might attribute to a garment or other theatrical thing? I hope this talk has opened up critical avenues such as these that are ripe for further investigation, while arguing for the particular value of proximity as a critical tool to unpick the complex and collaborative nature of embodied encounters with the materiality of the stage.